So, what really makes history happen? What's the engine that drives everything forward? Is it great leaders, big world-changing ideas, or is it something else entirely? Today, we're going to dig into one of the most powerful and, frankly, controversial answers ever proposed, a philosophy called dialectical materialism. It's a huge question, right? And for the better part of a century, this one theory claimed it had found the secret sauce, a hidden engine pushing society along from one stage to the next, all through conflict and change. So let's break down exactly what it is, where it came from, and what happened when it was let loose in the real world. All right, here's our game plan. We'll start with what this thing even is. Then we'll look at its pretty wild origins. We'll get into the mechanics, the so-called 3 laws of change. We'll see how it went from a bookish idea to a state-enforced doctrine. And finally, we'll have to tackle its very, very controversial legacy. Okay, let's jump right in. At its heart, you gotta understand that this isn't just a theory about history. It's a whole way of looking at the world. This whole framework was developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And they argued that the real, physical, tangible stuff in our lives, the economy, the technology we have, the way we make things, that's what really shapes everything else. Our politics, our culture, even the way we think. For them, ideas don't drive history, our material reality does. So where on earth did Marx and Engels cook this up? Well, they didn't just pull it out of thin air. They actually took a super famous philosophical idea and, pretty literally, flipped it completely upside down. And this slide right here shows the core of that flip. On one side, you had this big-time German philosopher, Hegel. He was an idealist. He thought history was really the story of ideas, of spirit, of consciousness slowly figuring itself out. But Marx came along and said, nope, you've got it backwards. He argued for materialism. It's not our thoughts that create the world we live in, it's the world we live in that creates our thoughts. You can kind of think of it like building a car. Hegel gave them the dialectic part. That's the engine, this idea of change happening through clashing opposites. Then another thinker, Feuerbach, he provided the materialism. That's the chassis and the wheels, the focus on the real physical world. Marx and Engels were the master mechanics who bolted it all together to create this new machine for explaining history. And hey, you don't have to take my word for it. Marx said it best himself. He saw that Hegel's method was brilliant, but he felt it was just kind of floating up in the clouds of abstract ideas. His whole mission was to drag it back down to earth and ground it in the real-world grit of economics and class struggle. Okay, so if history is all about this material conflict, how does the change actually happen? Well, Friedrich Engels laid out 3 so-called laws that are supposed to be the operating manual for how this whole thing works. Now, these laws were meant to be totally universal, applying to everything from chemistry to society to your own thoughts. So let's take a quick look at each one. The first law is all about tipping points. The idea is that you can have these small, slow, gradual changes piling up for a long, long time, but they don't go on forever. Eventually, you hit a critical point and bam, you get a sudden, revolutionary leap into something completely new. The classic example is heating water. As you add heat, the temperature goes up degree by degree, 97, 98, 99. That's the quantitative change. But at 100 degrees Celsius, you hit what they called a nodal point. The water doesn't just get hotter, it fundamentally changes its quality and transforms from a liquid into a gas, steam. For Marxists, social change works the same way. Small protests build up until they reach a revolutionary tipping point. All right, law number 2. This is the real engine room. It says that everything in the universe contains its own opposite. Think of a magnet. You can't have a North Pole without a South Pole. They're opposites, but they're unified in one thing, and their tension is what creates the magnetic field. For Marxists, the biggest contradiction in society was class, the owners, the bourgeoisie, and the workers, the proletariat. Their constant struggle is what drives history forward. This last one sounds a little out there, right? The negation of the negation. But stick with me. It basically describes the shape of progress. It's not a straight line, and it's not a circle that just repeats. It's a spiral. You start with something, it gets negated or overcome by its opposite, and then that gets negated, resulting in something new that's like the original but on a higher level. The example here is perfect. 1 grain of barley is negated when it sprouts into a plant. The plant is then negated when it dies but produces many new grains. It's progress, not just a loop. So this is where things take a major turn. This really complex philosophy didn't just stay in dusty old books. In the 20th century, it was picked up and transformed from a way to analyze the world into a blueprint for revolution and state power.
And you can see how the theory itself was forced to change. It started as a critique of industrial capitalism in places like England. Then Lenin took it and applied it to mostly rural, agrarian Russia, which was a huge shift. Then Stalin came along and basically turned it into a rigid, unquestionable state religion for the Soviet Union. And finally, Mao retooled it again for China, focusing on peasants instead of factory workers as the main revolutionary force.
This journey from a philosopher's desk to the absolute center of state power, well, it brings us to the biggest, most important question of all. What actually happened when these ideas were used to run entire countries?
I mean, a theory can sound amazing on paper, right? But the real test is always reality. So let's actually compare what the theory predicted would happen with what actually happened in history.
And when you look at the scoreboard, you see a pretty massive disconnect. The theory said revolutions would happen in the most advanced industrial countries, like Germany or the UK. Instead, they happened in largely agrarian nations, like Russia and China. It predicted the state would eventually wither away. Instead, those states became incredibly powerful, all-controlling totalitarian regimes. And it predicted capitalism would collapse under its own weight, but instead it adapted, creating things like welfare states and regulations.
And we have to talk about the human cost, which was just staggering. Beyond the failed predictions, policies that were justified using these ideas led to some of the worst human catastrophes imaginable. Programs like forcing all farmers onto collective farms in the Soviet Union, or the Great Leap Forward in China. These were presented as ways to speed up history, but they resulted in horrific famines and purges that killed tens of millions of people.
This led to some really powerful critiques. The philosopher Karl Popper made a famous argument that dialectical materialism had stopped being a scientific theory at all. He called it a pseudoscience. Why? Because every time reality didn't fit the theory, the followers would just tweak the theory to explain away the failure. If a theory can be twisted to explain literally any outcome and can never be proven wrong, then it doesn't really explain anything at all.
Which leaves us with a really challenging final thought. Dialectical materialism offered this powerful, compelling, all-in-one explanation for the entire sweep of human history. But its legacy, filled with those failed predictions and an almost unbelievable level of human suffering, it forces us to ask a tough question. Can any single grand theory truly explain the messy, complicated, and deeply unpredictable story of us? Maybe the engine of history is a lot more complex than that.